And I thank you for your statement. Let me begin the questioning, and I want to just go back to the beginning here. Could you tell the committee who made the recommendations to place on the list of U.S. attorneys to be fired each of the 9 U.S. attorneys who were in fact terminated last year?
Mr. Conyers, let me just say that in relation to Todd Graves, who I believe you're considering as the 9th, my recollection on that is slightly, I have slightly conflicting testimony or memories. So I'd prefer to leave him out of most of what I talk about today if I could.
You're going to be talking about the 8th.
Right.
All right.
I'm happy to tell you what I remember about Mr. Graves, but in my mind I have slightly conflicting memories of what happened there. So for purposes of the testimony, I'd prefer to reference the 8. In terms of those 8, I know that Mr. Sampson compiled the list, and I know that he told me that at different times he talked to different people about it. He never told me exactly who recommended which name and at what time they did that. And that's...
So, from your point of view, your answer to the question would be Kyle Sampson.
I mean, Mr. Sampson compiled the list. I know that he did speak to the Deputy Attorney General about it, and I know that he presented it to the Attorney General.
Mm-hmm. And the Attorney General being Mr. Alberto Gonzalez.
Yes, sir.
Now, let's just take one example, the one that is so paramount here. David Iglesias, who was not put on the list to be fired until November 2006, according to our records. Who put his name on the list, ma'am?
I don't know.
Well, who would you recommend a committee just seeking the facts in this matter? Who would you recommend to answer that question?
I think Mr. Sampson's the only person who can tell you at what point he put that name on the list. Mm-hmm. I can tell you that before I left the department, because of the questions about Mr. Iglesias, we had a staff meeting, and I believe the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General were in the room, as well as a number of those of us that had been involved in this process.
The Deputy Attorney General and the Attorney General.
Right. Yes, it was toward the end of my time, and I said, I asked the question at that point, I still don't know how Mr. Iglesias got on the list, and someone in the room just said that's been addressed, and that was all they said. So I didn't get from that answer an answer that I could provide to the committee.
Do you know who it was that gave that answer?
I don't remember.
Mm-hmm. Now, what did Mr. Kyle Sampson tell you about the origins of the process and how he came up with the names that were on the list? And I know you've had a number of discussions with him, but just pulling them all together as you can best recall.
To the best of my recollection, the first time he mentioned it to me was in January when he stopped by my office with a draft copy of the memorandum and asked me to take a look at that. I don't believe he gave me any context at that time. I had heard that he was engaged in an effort in mid-2005 because I was working in the executive office for U.S. attorneys, and I know that he had spoken with both Mary Beth Buchanan and Mike Battle at various points, and they had mentioned it to me. So I knew that he had been engaged in some effort to evaluate U.S. attorneys before I spoke to him in January about it, but that's the first I recall. And I don't remember him giving me any background at that point other than just handing me the memo and asking me to take a look at it. Later in the year, he sent me a memo in September, an email in September, and again, because he sent me the email, I don't remember that he gave me any context, of course, other than what was in the email. I think...
that was last year in 2006.
Yes, I'm sorry, in September of 2006. When we had the November 27th meeting, I feel like he did discuss a little bit of the context of this is something that he'd been working on for a while, but I don't recall that we had any specific conversation where he sat down and laid out to me the origins of the entire thing. There was some point that I remember him mentioning to me that he had consulted with different people throughout time. But he was my boss, and he didn't necessarily explain everything that he was doing or why to me. He just sometimes asked for my help, and I tried to provide it.
He didn't have to explain everything he was doing and why, did he? Because he was your boss.
Because he was my boss. I mean, I'm sure that there were other conversations, but if your question is asking, did he ever sit down and lay out for me exactly what this was all about, I don't recall if there was ever any point that he did that. It was just kind of from time to time he would show me something and ask for my thoughts, and I would gather some context from it. That's the best I can do.
Thank you very much. My time's expired. Ranking Member Lamar